The heavy brass key shrieked inside the lock like a rusted hinge on a coffin lid as Hank Mallory threw his shoulder against the door of his shop. He didn't notice the humidity or the smell of machine oil this morning. His eyes were fixed on the blue folder trembling in his hand, its gold foil logo smeared with dumpster grime. Outside, the low hum of idling excavators vibrated through the floorboards. A mechanical growl that felt less like construction and more like a siege. He spread the damp documents across his workbench, covering the very spot where his father had taught him to forge steel. A jagged red X was scrawled directly over his shop's coordinates, the ink still bleeding into the paper like a fresh wound. Just as he reached for the phone, a shadow blocked the morning sun. A man in a charcoal suit stood in the doorway, not to buy a hammer or a box of nails, but to check his watch and nod toward the heavy machinery moving into position at the end of the block. The flag Hank had hung just an hour ago snapped violently in a sudden wind, the fabric straining against the nails as the first wrecking ball swung into view. The heavy brass key shrieked inside the lock, a sound like a rusted hinge on a coffin lid, as Hank Mallory threw his shoulder against the oak door of the shop. It gave way with a familiar, stubborn groan, letting him into the cool, dim sanctuary of the Mallory Hardware store. Usually, the air here tasted of peace. A thick, comforting soup of machine oil, dry sawdust, and the metallic tang of iron filings. Today, however, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the unseasonable Pennsylvania humidity that had been clinging to Johnstown for a week. Hank didn't pause to let his eyes adjust. He moved with the practiced certainty of a man who had walked these floorboards for 60 years, his boots scuffing against the warped wood. He reached out, his calloused palm grazing a stack of fresh-cut pine boards. The golden sawdust clung to his skin, a fine grit that reminded him of work yet to be done. On the display counter, things were already beginning to pile up for the Memorial Day celebrations. Rolls of crimson ribbon, heavy boxes of brass flagpoles, and stacks of bunting that smelled of starch and old warehouses. Hank reached into the scarred drawer beneath the counter and pulled out his old hammer. The steel head was polished to a mirror shine by decades of striking nails, the hickory handle darkened and smoothed by the oils of his father's hands, and then his own. He stepped back toward the door frame, the heat of the street already beginning to bleed into the shop. With a series of rhythmic, echoing thuds that bounced off the high tin ceiling, he began to nail a faded American flag to the casing. Each strike was a punctuation mark in the morning silence. The wool of the flag was thick, snagging against the rough skin of his thumbs as he smoothed out the wrinkles, ensuring the stars and stripes hung straight. It was a ritual in a town where the mills had gone silent and the river ran gray with the ghosts of industry. These small acts of order were the only things keeping the rot at bay. He stepped back, his gray eyes, the color of weathered cement, tracking the way the fabric settled. The peace didn't last. The bell above the door didn't just jingle. It let out a startled, frantic yelp as a man in a charcoal Armani suit burst inside. The intruder brought with him the sharp, artificial scent of expensive cologne, a jarring intrusion into the shop's earthy aroma. Hank didn't move. He watched the man's polished loafers step gingerly across the dusty floor, leaving clear, arrogant tracks in the piles of shavings Hank hadn't bothered to sweep yet. The inspector didn't offer a greeting. He simply marched to the workbench and slammed a metal clipboard down onto the wood. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in a cathedral. A thin finger, ending in a manicured nail that had never known the bite of a splinter, stabbed at a long typed list. "Mallory," the man barked, his voice thin and shrill. "Section 4, subparagraph B. You're storing linseed oil within 3 feet of a secondary exit. That's a fire hazard. And look at this doorway. It's 2 inches shy of the new commercial accessibility codes." 2 inches, Hank. You can't just ignore the law because you've been here since the flood." Hank looked at the man's neck, which was turning a blotchy, bureaucratic crimson above his silk tie. He didn't speak. He just tightened his grip on the hammer, the weight of the tool familiar and grounded. He could smell the mint of the man's chewing gum now, a saccharine sweetness that made his stomach turn. The inspector didn't seem to care for the silence. He turned in a slow circle, his lip curling as he surveyed the high, cobwebbed rafters and the rows of hand-labeled drawers containing bolts, washers, and nails of every conceivable size. He leaned in closer to Hank, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, oily murmur. "You should look out those windows more often, Hank," the inspector whispered. "The world is moving. That old brick out there? It's going to be gravel in 6 months. The excavators are already idling at the edge of the district. If I were you, I'd pack up these relics while the city is still offering buyouts. In a few weeks, your inventory won't be worth the scrap weight." Hank's jaw tightened. The flat bridge of his nose, broken years ago in a factory scuffle and never truly set, seeming to sharpen. He felt a surge of cold, transparent anger. The inspector adjusted his tie, the silk sliding with a sound like a snake moving through dry grass. It felt like a noose being tightened, not just around Hank's neck, but around the throat of the entire historical quarter. The man looked through the dusty window toward the skyline, already seeing the ghost of some glass and steel monstrosity where the hardware store stood. When the man finally left, the silence that rushed back in felt hollow. Hank walked to the back of the store, his movements heavy. He reached for the black rotary phone on the wall, the cord tangled and caked with decades of grime. His fingers, thick and scarred, struggled with the dial. He knew the number by heart. He had called it when they were boys jumping into the Connemara River, and he had called it when the mills closed. The dial whirred with a sluggish, mechanical protest. When the line finally clicked open, it wasn't the man he wanted. Mayor Miller's office. A woman's voice snapped. It was a dry, brittle sound, like dead leaves being crushed under a boot. "Put me through to Artie," Hank said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Tell him it's Hank Mallory." "Mayor Miller is in a closed-door session with the Regional Development Board, Mr. Mallory," the secretary replied, her tone sharpening into a metallic edge. "His schedule is fully committed to the Vanguard Stroy investors for the foreseeable future. If you wish to lodge a grievance regarding a citation, you must file a formal petition at the annex." The line went dead before Hank could respond. The dial tone hummed in his ear, a flat, indifferent sound that left him standing in the shadows of his own history, clutching a plastic receiver that felt heavier than a sack of cement. The sun began to dip behind the jagged hills of the Allegheny front, turning the red brick walls of Johnstown the color of dried blood. Hank pulled on his weathered brown jacket, the smell of grease and old coffee rising from the collar. He didn't go home. Instead, he moved through the narrow, winding alleys of the historical center, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the cobblestones. He kept to the dark arches near the rear of the city hall, a massive, yellowing stone building that looked like a monument to a power that had long since rotted from within. Near the service entrance, the air grew foul, a mix of damp paper and rotting refuse. Hank paused as his boot crunched over a shard of broken glass. He pressed himself into the shadows, his heart drumming against his ribs like a trapped bird. Ahead of him, the municipal dumpsters were overflowing, their steel lids clattering in the sharp evening wind. Long, rolled-up blueprints and crumpled coffee cups spilled out like the guts of a slaughtered animal. Hank looked up at the windows of the city hall. They were dark, silent observers. He stepped toward the nearest bin, the stench of sour milk and old ink filling his nostrils. He reached into the cold, sticky interior, his hand disappearing into the trash. He moved aside wet bags of shredded documents and discarded lunch wrappers until his fingers brushed against something stiff. He pulled it out. It was a thick blue cardstock folder. On the front, embossed in a mocking gold foil, was a stylized skull, the logo of Vanguard Stroy. The edges were damp, sticking to his calloused palms. Hank fumbled for the small brass flashlight in his pocket. The beam cut through the gloom, landing on a glossy map of the downtown district. His breath hitched. The map wasn't just a plan. It was a hit list. Red crosses, thick and aggressive, had been marked over every building in his block. The strokes were messy, hurried, as if the person drawing them couldn't wait to see the structures fall. One cross, larger and more jagged than the rest, sat directly over the coordinates of Mallory Hardware. Beneath the map was a ledger, a series of spreadsheets that detailed relocation incentives and structural liabilities. His name was there, followed by a number that made his stomach turn. His life's work had been reduced to a line item, a sum of money that wouldn't even cover the cost of a new roof in a better town. The paper smelled of expensive tobacco and fresh toner, the scent of a betrayal that had been signed in a climate-controlled room while he was nailing a flag to a door. Hank didn't think. He didn't plan. He shoved the folder under his arm and marched toward the front of City Hall. He bypassed the security desk, his face a mask of gray cement, and ignored the startled cry of the secretary as he kicked open the double oak doors to the mayor's inner sanctum. The office was vast, smelling of lemon polish and top-shelf cognac. Arthur "Artie" Miller sat behind a desk of polished mahogany that looked as large as a landing craft. He was halfway through pouring a drink when the door hit the stopper. The crystal decanter rattled against the glass. "Hank?" Miller stammered, his face pale against his perfectly groomed silver hair. "What the hell are you doing? I'm in the middle of—" Hank didn't let him finish. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and slammed the damp, blue folder onto the mahogany. The impact sent a spray of droplets across the mayor's pristine blotting paper. The maps and the spreadsheets spilled out, fanning across the desk like a dealer's hand. "Look at it, Artie," Hank growled, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register. He leaned over the desk, his knuckles white as they pressed into the wood. "Look at the red ink. You told me this town was about heritage. You told me we were the backbone. Then you go and sell the spine to a bunch of suits from New York for a kickback." Miller regained his composure with a terrifying, practiced speed. He didn't look at the map. Instead, he reached out and slowly adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt, the gold links glinting in the soft lamplight. He stood up, his shadow stretching across the room, looming over Hank. "You're being emotional, Hank," Miller said. His voice was a cold, dry rustle, devoid of the warmth they had shared over 1,000 beers in their youth. "This isn't betrayal. It's evolution. Johnstown is a corpse. I'm just trying to give it a decent burial and build something that actually generates a tax base. You can't eat heritage, and you can't pay police salaries with the 3 boxes of nails you sell a week." He reached out and picked up the map, his eyes tracing the red lines with a chilling, clinical detachment. "The Vanguard Group is bringing in $400 million in capital," Miller continued, looking through Hank as if he were a smudge on a lens. "The historical district is a structural liability. We need high-density residential. We need progress. And progress requires a clean slate." Hank felt the heat rising in his neck. Progress? You're tearing out the heart of the city to build condos for people who won't even live here. You're selling our homes, Artie. My shop. My father's shop. Miller stepped around the desk, stopping just inches from Hank. He was taller, better fed, and his breath smelled of peppermint and expensive scotch. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a serpent's hiss. Listen to me very carefully, Hank. You stole municipal property from a secure disposal site. That's a felony. If so much as a whisper of that folder reaches the Tribune, you won't be worrying about your shop. You'll be worrying about a 6x8 cell in the county lockup. I'll have the sheriff seize your inventory as evidence before the sun goes down tomorrow. He placed a heavy, manicured hand on Hank's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of friendship. It was the grip of a jailer. Go home, Hank. Lock your doors. Sign the buyout papers when they arrive on Monday. Don't make me destroy you. I've got a city to save, and I won't let a stubborn old man with a hammer stand in the way of $1 billion redevelopment. Hank shook the hand off, as if it were a leech. He turned and stumbled out of the office, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway sounding like the rhythmic chopping of a guillotine. The neon lights of Main Street felt too bright, stabbing at his eyes as he stepped back onto the sidewalk. He needed air, but the city felt like it was closing in, the buildings leaning toward each other to whisper about his ruin. Near the old bakery, he saw a familiar figure. Joe, the baker, was standing under a street lamp, waving a rectangular slip of paper. Joe's face was dusted with white flour, making him look like a ghost in the flickering light. He was grinning, a frantic, wide-eyed expression that bordered on the manic. "Hank! Hank, look at this!" Joe shouted, shoving a check toward Hank's face. "The Vanguard people. They just dropped it off. 6 figures, Hank. 6. I'm out. I'm selling the ovens and moving to Sarasota. No more snow, no more gray sky." Hank looked at the check, then at the bakery. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of yeast and cinnamon that had defined this block for a century. Behind Joe, at the end of the street, the silhouettes of yellow excavators sat in the shadows, like prehistoric predators waiting for the dawn. "Joe, they've got red crosses on every house on the block," Hank said, his voice cracking. "They're going to level it. Don't you remember when the roof caved in after the '98 storm? We spent 3 weeks up there with the shingles and the tar. You said this place was your legacy." Joe's smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, defensive sneer. He snatched the check back and tucked it into his pocket. "Legacy doesn't pay for a hip replacement, Mallory." Joe spat. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You're just a bitter old man holding onto a pile of rust. Why should the rest of us stay in the dirt just because you're too stubborn to move? The city is moving on. Either get on the bus or get under the wheels, but stop trying to drag me down with you." Joe turned and marched back into his shop, the bell jingling with a final, dismissive ring. He flipped the sign to closed and pulled the shade, leaving Hank standing alone under a flickering street lamp that hummed with a dying, electric buzz. Hank turned toward his own shop, his boots heavy on the pavement. He was halfway across the street when the silence of the night was shattered. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the alley, followed by the crystalline shimmer of falling glass. He ran. Rounding the corner, he saw his shop. The large front window, the one he had painstakingly cleaned just that morning, was gone. In its place was a jagged, toothy hole. Shards of thick plate glass lay scattered across his display of crimson ribbons and white pine, glinting like diamonds in the moonlight. A heavy brick lay in the center of the floor, wrapped in a piece of lined notebook paper. Hank picked it up, his fingers trembling. "Move out or burn out," the scrawl read. He looked toward the end of the alley. For a split second he saw a shadow, a dark jacket, a hood pulled low, disappearing around the corner of the old warehouse. Hank didn't chase him. He stood there looking at the blood on his thumb where a stray shard had nicked him. The blood was dark, nearly black in the shadows, dripping slowly onto the golden sawdust. He decided to take the shortcut through the narrow passage behind the warehouses, a place where the sun never touched the ground. He was halfway through when the shadows moved. Two men stepped out from behind a rusted shipping container. They wore gray hoodies, their faces obscured. Hank stopped, his hand instinctively going to the blue folder tucked inside his jacket. "The mayor wants his paperwork back, old man," one of them said. The voice was young, flat, and bored. Before Hank could react, a heavy hand shoved him from behind. He flew forward, his face slamming into the cold, abrasive brick of the warehouse wall. The rough stone tore at his cheek. He felt the hot sting of a scrape and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. They pinned him there, the smell of cheap cigarettes and stale sweat filling his world. A fist slammed into his kidneys, a dull, sickening thud that stole his breath. He slumped, but he didn't let go of the folder. He hugged it to his chest, curled into a ball as a heavy boot found his ribs. "Give it up," the voice hissed. Hank found a surge of primal, desperate strength. He drove his elbow backward, feeling it connect with something soft, a nose, a jaw. There was a grunt of pain. Hank didn't wait to see the result. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the fire in his side, and bolted toward the back entrance of his shop. His hands shook so violently he could barely find the keyhole. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of boots on the asphalt. The lock clicked. He dived inside and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt just as a heavy weight hit the wood from the outside. The door groaned, but held. Hank didn't stop. He grabbed his massive oak workbench, a piece of furniture that weighed 300 pounds, and began to shove it across the floor. The wood screamed against the boards, a long, agonizing screech that filled the dark shop. He pushed until the bench was wedged firmly against the door. He sank to the floor, his back against the workbench, listening to the muffled curses and the retreating footsteps outside. He was alone. The darkness of the shop felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a bunker. He clutched the damp, torn remains of the Vanguard documents, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought a pale, sickly light that filtered through the broken window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Hank was jolted awake by a sharp, rhythmic rapping on the remaining glass of the door. A mail carrier in a blue uniform stood there. He didn't look at Hank. He didn't even look at the broken window or the blood on the floor. He simply slid a thick, white envelope through the mail slot and walked back to his truck. Hank crawled over and picked it up. The return address was the City of Johnstown Department of Building and Safety. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a gold seal. Official notice of eminent domain and demolition. The date was set for the Tuesday after Memorial Day. 48 hours. The document spoke of unrecoverable structural blight and urgent public necessity. Hank looked around his shop. He saw the drawers of nails, the rows of saws, the hammer his father had used to build the very shelves that held the store together. He walked to the back, to a small, hidden compartment beneath the floorboards behind the counter. He pulled out a long, leather-bound case. The leather was cracked, smelling of old oil and wood smoke. He unzipped it and pulled out a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. The bluing on the barrels was worn, but the action was smooth as silk. He sat on a stool in the center of his ruined shop, took a piece of oiled flannel, and began to polish the steel. He didn't look at the demolition notice again. He just watched the door, his gray eyes turning to ice. The quiet was broken not by a knock, but by the sudden, invasive wail of a siren. It wasn't the distant moan of an ambulance. It was the sharp, urgent yelp of a cruiser pulling up directly in front of the shop. Hank looked up, his vision blurred by a lack of sleep. Through the jagged teeth of the broken window, the world was a strobe light of red and blue. The flashes bounced off the dusty jars of lacquer, making the shop look like it was underwater. He saw the yellow tape first, a thick plastic ribbon being stretched across his storefront by an officer he didn't recognize. The tape snapped in the wind, a dry, rhythmic sound that felt like a lash. Police line. Do not cross. They were sealing him in, or perhaps sealing the world out. Heavy boots thudded on the wooden porch. A shadow blocked the light as an officer pressed a sheet of paper against the door. Hank heard the rapid-fire thwack, thwack, thwack of a staple gun. The officer then took a heavy steel chain, looped it through the door handles, and snapped a massive padlock shut. "Hank Mallory," the officer shouted through the wood. "This property has been declared a public safety hazard. By order of the mayor's office, you are to vacate immediately. Any person found on the premises after 0900 hours will be subject to arrest for criminal trespass." Hank didn't move. He watched the officer's silhouette retreat. He was a prisoner in his own history. He looked at the shotgun in his lap, then at the blue folder. He couldn't stay here. Staying here was waiting for the end. He had to get to the square. He had to show them the red crosses. He remembered the old coal chute. It was a relic of the days when the shop was heated by a furnace in the cellar, a narrow stone tunnel that led to the alley behind the block. He moved to the subfloor, tearing away a section of rotted carpet. The iron ring of the chute was rusted, cold to the touch. He pulled, the metal screaming in protest, until it swung open to reveal a black, soot-stained throat. He stuffed the blue folder inside his shirt, the cold cardboard biting into his skin. He lowered himself into the dark, the smell of damp earth and old coal dust filling his lungs. He crawled on his belly, the rough stone scraping his elbows, until he saw a sliver of gray light at the end of the tunnel. He emerged behind a stack of rotted pallets, coughing and covered in black grime. He wasn't alone. 3 men in leather jackets were waiting by the dumpsters. They weren't cops. They were the same shadows from the night before, their knuckles bruised, their eyes hard. One of them was idly tapping a length of rebar against his palm. "Mayor said you might try the back way, Hank," the one in the center said. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto Hank's boot. "Give us the folder, and we'll let you walk to the bus station. Don't give it to us, and you won't be walking anywhere." Hank didn't speak. He measured the distance to the end of the alley. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the distant, upbeat sound of a brass band starting up on the main square. "I don't have it." Hank lied, his voice a low, vibrating growl. The man with the rebar grinned. "We can check, or we can just break your ribs and find out for ourselves." They began to close the circle. Hank backed away, his hand catching the edge of an industrial trash compactor. He felt the weight of it, the rust flaking off under his fingers. As the first man lunged, Hank threw his entire weight into the dumpster next to him. It was on a slight incline, its wheels screeching as it lurched forward. The heavy steel bin slammed into the lead man, pinning his leg against the brick wall with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, a high, thin sound that was lost in the sudden roar of the crowd from the square. Hank didn't wait. He grabbed a handful of loose gravel and flung it into the eyes of the second man, then dived into a thick cloud of steam venting from the laundry of the hotel next door. The white mist swallowed him, smelling of bleach and hot iron. He ran, his heart hammering against the folder in his shirt, the sound of his own boots lost in the rhythmic thumping of the parade drums. He burst out of the alley and into the light of the square. The transition was jarring. Thousands of people were packed into the center of Johnstown, a sea of bright summer clothes, fluttering flags, and children sitting on their fathers' shoulders. The air was sweet with the scent of funnel cakes and popcorn. High above the crowd, on a temporary stage draped in heavy red bunting, stood Arthur Miller. He looked magnificent, a statesman in a charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the sun as he leaned toward a bank of microphones. Today, we don't just remember the past. Miller's voice boomed through the massive speaker stacks, echoing off the brick facades. We look to a future where Johnstown rises again, where the rust is replaced by glass, and where our children have a city they can be proud of. The crowd erupted in applause. Hank tried to push forward, but he hit a wall of blue. A line of police officers, their arms linked, were holding the perimeter of the VIP section. "Move back, sir," a young officer said, his hand resting on his belt. "I need to speak," Hank gasped, his face smeared with coal dust and blood. "I have proof. The mayor is selling the district. He's tearing down your homes." The officer didn't even blink. He shoved Hank back with a stiff forearm. "This is a restricted zone. Take it to the sidewalk or you're going to the station." Hank looked up at the stage. Miller was smiling, shaking hands with a group of men in sharp, charcoal suits, the developers. The sun caught the gold of Miller's watch, a bright, mocking flash. Hank looked at the building next to him. It was an old 3-story walk-up, its fire escape a skeleton of rusted iron hanging over the alley. He didn't think about his age or his aching ribs. He jumped, his fingers catching the bottom rung. The metal groaned, a flake of orange rust falling into his eye. But he pulled himself up. He climbed, his lungs burning, his vision narrowing until there was only the next rung, and the next. He reached the roof and ran across the gravel, his boots crunching. At the edge of the roof, he looked down. The stage was directly below him, a mere 10-foot drop onto the red carpet behind the backdrop. He jumped. The impact jarred his teeth, a sharp pain shooting through his ankles as he hit the plywood decking. He rolled, coming up behind the heavy velvet curtain. He could hear Miller's breath through the speakers, a rhythmic, wet sound. Hank stepped through the curtain. The silence that hit the square was absolute. One moment, the mayor was talking about urban renewal, and the next, a man covered in soot, blood, and rage was standing behind him. Miller turned, his face draining of color. For a second, he looked like the boy he had been, terrified and small. Hank didn't give him a chance to speak. He stepped to the microphone, his hand clamping onto the steel stand with a grip that would have crushed bone. The feedback shrieked, a piercing wail that made the front row flinch. "Artie says he's building a future." Hank's voice roared through the speakers, deep and jagged as a mountain range. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the blue folder. He ripped the pages out, the sound of tearing paper amplified into a series of sharp cracks. He threw them into the air. The wind, caught in the canyon of the square, grabbed the maps and the spreadsheets. They swirled over the crowd like white leaves, the red crosses visible even from the back rows. "Look at the papers," Hank screamed. "Look at the red ink. He's not building a city. He's cashing a check. Page 12. Read page 12. He calls your homes structural ballast. He calls your lives liabilities." Miller finally found his voice. "Get him off the stage. He's a trespasser. He's unstable." Two of the mayor's security detail lunged for Hank. They grabbed his arms, their fingers digging into his bruised muscles. They jerked him backward, his heels skidding across the plywood. "Look at the signatures," Hank yelled, even as they dragged him toward the edge. "Signed 6 months ago, before he even told you there was a plan." The crowd was no longer cheering. They were looking at the papers falling into their laps. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the square. Not a cheer, but a growl. The security guards were heavy, professional. They pinned Hank against the railing, their weight crushing the breath from his lungs. Hank looked at Miller, who was trying to regain control of the microphone, his hands shaking. But then, the stage shook. A man in a grease-stained cap, a man Hank had worked with at the mill 20 years ago, climbed over the front rail. He didn't look at Hank. He looked at the police officer who was reaching for his mace. The worker didn't say anything. He just stood there, his chest out, a silent, immovable wall of denim and muscle. Then another man climbed up. And another. Within seconds, a dozen men in work boots and faded jackets had formed a circle around Hank. They didn't attack. They just stood there, arms crossed, their faces as hard as the steel they used to forge. The security guards hesitated, their eyes darting to the crowd. The square was a tinderbox. The police moved forward with their shields, but they stopped 10 feet from the stage. They were looking at the crowd, at their own neighbors, their own fathers. The line didn't break, but it didn't advance. Hank stood up, brushing the soot from his jacket. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit, the lead investor. The man looked at the sea of angry faces, at the red crosses being held up like accusations, and he didn't see a tax base. He saw a PR nightmare. Without a word, the investor turned and walked off the back of the stage. He didn't look at Miller. He just kept walking toward his black car, his briefcase held tight to his chest. Miller was left alone at the podium. He looked out at the people he had grown up with, and for the first time in his life, he saw them. He saw the anger, the betrayal, and the sudden, terrifying clarity in their eyes. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Hank, his mouth working silently, and then he turned and fled. The square didn't erupt in violence. It erupted in talk. Hank walked down the stairs of the stage, his legs feeling like lead. The crowd parted for him, a silent, respectful opening. Joe, the baker, stepped forward. He looked at the check in his hand, the one with the 5 zeros, and then he looked at the red cross on the map he was holding. With a slow, deliberate motion, Joe tore the check into 4 pieces and let them fall into the gutter. He reached out and squeezed Hank's shoulder, his hand warm and trembling. "I forgot the smell of the yeast, Hank," Joe whispered. "I forgot." Hank walked back toward his shop. The yellow tape was still there, but someone had already torn it down. The chains were gone, lying in the dirt like shed skins. He stepped inside. The shop was a mess. Broken glass, a ruined window, a brick on the floor. But the air still smelled of machine oil and dry wood. He saw Joe standing by the window with a broom, carefully sweeping the shards into a bucket. Other neighbors were arriving, carrying plywood and hammers. Hank sat down at his workbench. He picked up his hammer, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He looked at the empty space where the window had been, and then he looked at the people working to fix it. The city was still poor. The mills were still closed. The river was still gray. Но в тишине лавки, под стук молотков и звук голосов, Хэнк почувствовал, как в его груди что-то оттаивает. Он не спас мир. Он просто спас один квартал. Но, глядя на свои натруженные руки, он понял, что этого достаточно. Настоящая реновация началась не с бетона, а с того, что люди снова начали смотреть друг другу в глаза. Он закрыл глаза и впервые за 20 лет не увидел брата в реке. Он увидел только Джонстаун, старый, разбитый, но все еще стоящий. И этого было достаточно.